Welcome. Great to be here again after 3 years. Those of you who may not know, the British system is such that you have your sabbatical every 3 years for one term. So every 3 years I find myself in Bilkent. Today, this is a very broad title for me, but what I'll be doing is actually talk about 4 articles, primarily the last one that is in progress at the moment, and the 3 that were recently published. But they all constitute what I believe a coherent whole, and their focus is on how mainstream development policy and practice changed over the past decade or so since the global financial crisis. And the context here is fourfold. There's increased multipolarity, rising powers, and all of that. So that's a international different context. In terms of the IMF and the World Bank, there's change in lending practice, framework, patterns, all sorts of things are taking place, and that's my main consideration here. Transformations in international development regime in general, new actors, new initiatives are emerging. So there is that, and also obviously the recession of democracy, the rise of anti-globalism, those macro-political forces unfolding over the past few years. So within that very wide context, I'll look at particularly what the IMF and the World Bank have been doing, and here are the articles. As usual, I shouldn't have had the text coming down very much because every single time this is a problem, but just bear with me there. The program itself, my research program, is potentially more about international political economy, but also I think it has applications to wider politics of international development. So that's the context. There will be a lot of detail coming up. So these are my 2 main findings. So say the most important thing at the outset. First of all, even though the IMF and the World Bank are known to be very unwieldy bureaucracies that are very resistant to reform and so on, they do indeed have various adaptive efforts in the face of this new dynamic context. Right? So they're not unchanging entities. They try to retain their supremacy in the international system, and they are important actors shaping the new regime. And there is a broad direction of that change, and I could summarize it as the partial abandonment of a normative rigidity, more flexibility, especially on the ground. Some call that the decoupling of ideas and institutions, so that's another way to look at it. But they're less eager to push for these universalist, one-size-fits-all types of policies. And the scope of policy advice is also important. There was a time, as I'll tell in a few minutes, when these institutions pushed for very broad, comprehensive political changes as prerequisites for economic development. Now I think they're a bit more careful in their steps. 3 main dimensions of everything I have done so far. What's happening? So I look at lending data, but also non-lending behavior. And some of the evidence comes from interviews on the field and off the field with staff of these organizations. Why do these changes take place? There are external factors to explain that, but my main focus has been on internal operational considerations. What happens at the cold face of development finance? You go to a country, you have a country program, you have a partnership framework, there are borrowers, you have your standard operating procedures, and in that hectic environment, things change. And there are consequences of this process, very much paralleling what I said before. Existing platforms of multilateralism do tend to survive with modifications, and yet there's the abandonment of rigid policy paradigms. You could interpret that as widening of development policy space in some sense. So the first one, this is the looking at primarily how the World Bank engages emerging powers. I looked at all World Bank commitments in 7 of its all-time largest borrowers. These include Argentina, Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, Mexico, and Turkey. I call them Big 7. And there was this debate in the early 2000s that emerging powers would be shunning these international organizations. They would be avoiding them. They wouldn't go to the IMF or the World Bank. The IMF part turned out to be true, but they continued borrowing from the World Bank. And I was interested in exactly what does the bank lend for in these countries, in these economies. So what I realized there is that the organization itself, the World Bank, is more adaptable than it appears. There are discrete adaptations there, and there is an ideation and operational realignment of the relationship between the World Bank and emerging countries. So the current order might be a bit more resilient than it appears at first. Bounded diversity, precisely what's happening. There is a bit more emphasis on physical and market infrastructure. Right? This is your classic national capitalist development 1950s ideas of build dams, but also regulate your financial sector and all that. These are the the build the markets, build the infrastructure for capitalist development. A bit more of that. There is retained emphasis on social sustainability, various social inclusion, poverty reduction. These seem to hold. But when it comes to these policy-heavy governance and institutional reforms, very difficult, very arduous reforms, there's a decline across the board in commitments towards those kinds of projects. But when you look at individual countries, there's a lot of variation. Some countries, such as Brazil, still use these governance reforms in order to discipline local governments. It's a federalist system. The national government borrows from the World Bank to push through fiscal transparency, public expenditure management, anti-corruption practices across the country, for instance. So there is a lot of diversity as well. But for larger borrowers, engaging with the bank has become less onerous and more rewarding. So that's interesting. Here is the Big 7, slight increase in physical market infrastructure. This is a weighted thematic analysis. I can share my data here. This is basically World Bank data. I didn't make it up. Here is social sustainability. Again, holds more or less. And here's your governance. Across the board decline, more so perhaps in the Big 7. And here's an example. This is an exaggerated version of Big 7 trends, what's happening in Turkey. Compared to, by the way, comparisons are between 2002 to 2008 versus 2009, 2015, fiscal years in the World Bank. Look at the massive rise in A. Here it is the physical and market infrastructure, increased commitments towards there. In terms of social sustainability, the black bar is Turkey, holds constant, and look at governance. It dropped from 19% of commitments to 2%. Good question. It is, the World Bank does categorize its lending based on themes. And under this is primarily anti-corruption, transparency, accountability, social inclusion sometimes. So it's a whole bunch. But I can go back and show the entire categorization. There's another article.
So that would be like lending in order to deal with corruption?
for example, you want to set up an anti-corruption agency. You have to, you want to refurbish your transparency systems. Kamu ihale kurumu, stuff like that. But the World Bank, what the World Bank does is that when, let's say there is a DPL, right, a development policy loan, which is about growth and inclusiveness. They give it a big name, and then they say this is about 5 major themes: inclusion, economic management, this and that. And under that, they would say 17% of this project is about rule of law, for example, judicial system, right? So that is your governance themes. But I'll explain it further in a few minutes. So this is what's happening, and the basic conclusion here is that the bank has a built-in flexibility that most other institutions don't possess, because there hasn't been very many changes in the way it lends, but without adjustments to its mandate, it can accommodate changing preferences. So, in general, though, there is a shift away from the deep causes of developmental failure and towards what the policy elites in the country want to borrow for. Right? So, Turkey says, I don't care what you think about me as much. There's a different process here, but I want to borrow from you for these and these kinds of projects. And we can discuss why that happens in a different context.
Perhaps.
Yes.
Sure, but so you're already interpreting this, which perhaps you provide more information on this, but as something coming, sort of changes in the norms or preferences of the World Bank. But I guess such things have like a supply and demand element.
Yes, definitely.
That it might well be that the needs of the country.
Yes, certainly. Yeah.
Global crisis.
Yeah.
So is there a way of sort of distinguishing those supply and demand elements?
I think they're both involved. I do say that the borrower preferences are quite significant. Having said that, I don't think that you can go into a single country and say how much of this lending pattern comes from what the borrowers want and how much of it is. But yeah.
Time trend, perhaps,
no, I haven't done that. Not yet, at least. But a good question. Moving on, there are 3 more pieces. This was a very policy-oriented piece on the IMF and the World Bank and how they deal with emerging powers. I won't get into much detail here. Normative, operational, and competitive pressures coming from rising powers. And how do these organizations meet these challenges? A lot of ad hoc adaptation taking place. When it comes to low-income countries and smaller middle-income countries or conventional South, they are about preserving their client base and expanding their operations through various changes in lending framework as well. When it comes to large MICs, middle-income countries, they're more flexible, so that was the previous article. And in terms of their non-lending activity, they reinforce their status in the global system. They are less rigid about what development means on the ground as policy practice. That is the basis, again, repeating the general point. This is an article that came out this year. It looks at the post-Washington consensus that has been the reigning policy paradigm in the IMF and the World Bank. It is an upgrade of orthodox neoliberalism. Think of that neoliberal globalist privatize, deregulate, liberalize, internal, external liberalization perspective. Around that, there are 2 other halves now. On the one side, there is social sustainability, poverty reduction, human development, various ways, but also good governance, right? Regulatory reforms, You have to have that regulatory state for a market-oriented policy framework to deliver. Its origins could be found in the contested failure of market reforms in the 80s and 90s, leading to calls for second stage reforms, and the string of crises in emerging countries throughout the 1990s was an important catalyst there, the Asian crisis, right? So what should we have? We shouldn't have just growth for the sake of growth. We should have high quality growth. What does that mean? It should be inclusive, it should be sustainable, poverty reduction should be a core objective, so distribution is important. How can you achieve that? You require an area of market enhancing institutions, from narrow institutions, regulating the financial sector, public expenditure management, and so on, to very broad ones, good governance, good judicial system, education, right? So this is the idea. Very comprehensive institutional reforms are required for liberalized markets to deliver high quality growth. So that's the basic idea. But of course, I'm oversimplifying a bit. But the result was the ambitious expansion of the prescriptive gaze of the IMF and the World Bank. So before they were looking at very specific items, now they look at countries as, from a much, much wider perspective. How can we conceptualize this paradigm? It's not a paradigm shift. It's an expansion. It's some call that the augmented Washington consensus, right? Others call it Washington consensus plus. Right? Layering, this is interesting. You have one policy norm, you put another on top of it rather than substituting. Right? So, it's just like this moussaka, sort of thing. And the other one is the exploitation. So you exploit your existing competences. So you're already good at the financial policy side. You're already good at the monetary policy side. So you expand those towards very specific reforms. Plus you explore, right? You go into different areas, such as governance was one such area for these organizations. So narrow institutions, financial sector, tax administration, public financial management, but then broad institutions, quality of governance, property rights, control of corruption. These are very political items, right? This is what politics is all about. Distribution of resources, the clientelism, all those networks. You want to disrupt those at some level. And that proved a bit difficult. I looked at MONA, this is monitoring of fund arrangements, a database that cites all structural and all qualitative and quantitative conditionality in IMF facilities. I looked at 100 largest programs, both towards middle-income countries and low-income countries, SBAs and poverty reduction growth facilities and their extensions after 2009. There is sustained emphasis on fiscal, monetary, and financial measures in IMF conditionalities. Collapse of public and corporate governance conditionalities. We can look at these if you want, if we have time, what exactly those conditionalities are. There are very few now. And the social policy conditionalities are in decline. Already the IMF was not very interested in those. Here are the figures. This is just the basic art of counting. You go through these facilities and look at what the conditions, and you just count them one by one. After the crisis, more emphasis. This is extended credit facilities, poverty reduction growth facilities towards low-income countries. These are middle-income countries. A lot more emphasis in low-income countries towards these. Restructure your fiscal and monetary systems. Financial policy, you could say perhaps in middle-income countries, those reforms were already made in the 2000s, so there's not as much emphasis, but some. Look at governance, complete collapse. No conditionalities about governance, again. And social policy. Already in low-income countries, IMF was not very interested in those. Now, even in middle-income countries, says, I don't want to be part of this. Although there are social spending targets in IMF conditionalities and programs these days, so it's a bit complicated. Here is the World Bank. Again, no, they're not the same countries. It's the largest countries, and sometimes, yeah.
Could it be that these guys have stopped doing business with the countries that the most need
Yeah.
these governance,
Yeah.
and therefore they no longer have these provisions, programs?
That's one way of looking at it, potentially, but I don't think so. I looked at the largest poverty reduction growth facilities, regardless of which countries are included. So you can look at, there are 100 programs in each of these. So I would imagine that when the numbers are high enough, those kinds of irregularities will be taken care of. But
it would be nice to compare same country programs in the two periods and see whether these countries' conditionalities have changed.
Yes, I did look at a few countries that had programs before and after the crisis, and it was quite similar. And you could also, I interviewed IMF people, and that's what they told me as well. But here is the World Bank data a bit. So there is that. And look at the broad institutions themes. These are themes per project. And these classic governance items, anti-corruption, there's far less funding for these. So what to make of this? I think operational imperatives are important. There was already a lot of resistance from within the World Bank towards having these kinds of reforms in its clients. Right? I'll come to that in a minute. So this was not an agenda where these organizations were breezing through. There was already a lot of pushback, both from clients and from within the organization. And over the past decade, we seem to have reached a tipping point there. Having said that, when there is demand, right, there are very classic governance reforms are still available. All right, this is within their repertoire. And if a country goes to the World Bank and says, I want to have this anti-corruption agency established and run properly, the World Bank says, fine, we have that on our menu, there you go. All right, so there's that. The rise of emerging powers is a factor in there. There's less demand, definitely. They say, we need infrastructure, we need electricity grids, we need renewable energy, right? We need these kinds of things, and we're not as interested in governance items. And the way the World Bank does business is very, very specific. You can't go to a country and say, I want to lend you money for this particular project. The demand has to come from the country. Yes?
In fact, I was just going to say, for the World Bank, probably a lot of this is demand-driven, meaning that
all of it is demand-driven, but the way it happens is, I'll come to it in a minute, the way it happens is also very suggestive.
Right, but I completely agree that there are a lot of internal-driven issues, but the labeling of what these projects are might actually be very much faithful to what the initiation procedure is about.
That is quite possible.
Because, like the few areas of World Bank I have looked at or spoken to people with very biased sample is their take is we are much more sensitive to issues of institutions, politics, corruption, and for instance, when you look at their sort of big projects in Africa, they would claim that they are much more sensitive to the issue of corruption in that context. But that would be about the operation of a project, not the labeling. So the labeling is, countries are coming to you and they don't want anything to touch to anti-corruption because they have funding from China and that would go very well. but they want funding for something else, that's going to be reflected in that.
No, you're absolutely right. I'll come to that in a minute. They do a lot of work that is about anti-corruption. It is not called anti-corruption. And their internal, what they call the fiduciary systems, have changed quite a bit. Yeah, yeah.
Also, 2008 are, the global financial crisis that probably did change the demand for the types of projects, and China,
yeah,
which has sort of both through its direct lending and other interventions in the World Bank sort of board, has probably had some effects of what.
Maybe not the latter, but I'll come to it in a minute. Just bear with me, just 10 more minutes. Yes.
A couple of questions.
Yes.
What about the resources of the World Bank?
Yes.
Crisis? That's one thing.
Yeah.
The other is the internal project evaluation unit in the World
Yes.
Bank.
Yes. IEG. Yeah.
Policy effectiveness.
I'll come to it too. Yes, definitely. On the resources side, of course, they are the IBRD, the middle income countries, and IDA are different horses. And for a while, IDA projects even overtook IBRD, and there's a difference between how project patterns, lending patterns evolve in these different kinds of. But in general, I think the World Bank resources are quite healthy, and when I speak to people, they say we can't really meet demand. So there's that aspect, and I'll come to the second point in a minute. So again, what is important to me is that this is not a change in policy paradigm. This is a change in policy practice. The paradigm is still there, right? The menu items are there, but how it is done, right, what it is called, and what is available to what is the main difference here. Whether governance matters or not, you don't know that until you hit the country, you hit the ground in a country, in a client. So there is a lot of flexibility in terms of what the IMF and the World Bank do in their clients. Here's the latest project. I did some field work towards this in DC, interviewed people in governance global practice, in development research group, and several other parts of the bank. What is happening in the declining component of the post-Washington consensus, this governance idea? Of course, they say, it's not in decline, definitely. The way things are coded change. The emphasis is still there. But yeah, there's decline in loan commitments, that's given, and avoidance of governance-related lending by many large MICs. Yet the World Development Report 2017, the flagship publication of the bank, was called Governance and the Law. When you look at the way the World Bank was reorganized in 2014, this large unit called Governance Global Practice turned out to be one of the largest, most populous arms of the bank. So what are the origins of the agenda? How is it internalized? And what happened, why it happened over the past decade? It's an important question. This is the leading multilateral organization in the North about development cooperation and development finance. And how it approaches, both in terms of both thinking and practice, this archetypal foundational question of political economy, the political context of economic development. That is what governance is about. You can look at it in frame the question in two different ways. There is a big literature on international organizations, so you can look at any shift as a change in international organizational behavior, apply the theories there. That would be a narrow way of looking at it. Or you can look at it as a change in international norms. So there is a big literature there about how the IMF and the World Bank own these development norms. And it's also important because the bank was the main cauldron, the main meeting point of ideas about governance in the 1990s and early 2000s. A lot of the policy views came from the bank. Yet, is governance itself a norm? I don't know. What you mean by the word norm in international politics is slightly different. How does it constrain behavior? Is it a rule? When you look at good governance, it is something aspirational, right? But governance itself is probably a state of existence, maybe a constraint, a recurrent theme, right? So it is a bit problematic to look at governance itself as a norm as we see it from international relations theory. Here's the main observation. For the bank, governance has ceased to become a pathological category. Right? There's this thing called governance, and a lot of times things go wrong there. A lot of developing countries have bad governance. All right? There are diseases of corruption. Right? Developing countries are distinguished from developed countries primarily for not having effective governments, for having lots of corruption, right? For not having enough transparency and so on. So this is something pathological, so we should fix it. That was the philosophy in around the turn of the century. Now it's a bit different. This was a formalist, reformist idea. They had this notion that what is good governance? How does a democracy work and all that? So let's do that. Here, it is more selective, more functionalist. The idea is that you could have the same results with different kinds of forms, with different kinds of setups, could create the same level of government effectiveness, for example. More discretionary, more refined, less formalistic view. But it is still there. From an IO behavior perspective, is this an organized hypocrisy? Gap between talk and action is always a question. Or are we looking at a norm decline, norm degeneration? And if that's the case, you have to look at other organizations as well, how this idea of governance is articulated these days in these organizations. And there is much work to be done there. Looking at the governance ideas in the bank itself, there is a birth date, 1992, a policy paper called Governance and Development. For the first time, brings up issues of accountability, transparency, and corruption. This is about Africa, right? That paper was about Africa. Early period, you could call it incubation. The term is being used a lot more. World Development Report, State in a Changing World, very transformative. Cancer of Corruption speech by Wolfensohn, 1996. Post-Asian crisis, takeoff, this less known text by Shahid Burki and Guillermo Perry, quite important, Institutions Matter. Kaufman, Cry, and others came up with governance indicators. Voice and accountability, political stability. These are still being compiled, and you have all that data available. This is still used. And they have very specific uses for the World Bank, by the way. These are not things that are just out there, but these are day-to-day workings of the World Bank uses these indicators. The classic Poverty Reduction and Economic Management Network published this very important report, Building Public Institutions and Strengthening Governance. WDR reports, early 2000s, Institutional Turn in Development Economics. Some of you would know all about that. And finally comes to this GAC agenda, Governance and Anti-Corruption, Paul Wolfowitz. Very hard-headed figure, very harsh. And he came to the bank and said, look, there are all these issues here, all this corruption taking place in bank operations. I'll find you out. I'll just clean up the whole area. From the mid-2000s onwards, strong criticism from within, a lot of scholarly criticism. Here are some of that. I'll just skip this bit and came to what happened after 2011-12. Which I think is an important transition point, because when the global crisis hit, sudden resurgence of commitments. They did what they had been doing for a while, but afterwards, around 2011-12, they just started to think differently. They had that space. Again, more discretionary approach. The organization is less interested in design templates, quite important. So there is that bit. Why does this happen? Again, secular dynamics of the lending environment. There's a demand side, and I won't go further in there. But also, there are bureaucratic organization within the bank. What happened is that the way the World Bank approaches a country has changed over the past few years. What they do first is that the bank within itself come together. They do a process called systematic country diagnostics. And then they go to the country and establish something called country partnership framework. There's a lot more ownership of the country over the program, so that's one thing. And within that, governance emerged as a supporting topic, but not a substantive topic as much. Fewer purely governance-related reform programs. Growing aversion to old-style blueprints. Say, the notion that we have rigid notions of what needs to be done and the recipe book of how to do it. It's not today's reality. That was 30 years ago. So they're very specific about that. We'll go to each country and tailor something differently. And the governance is talked about differently. The language is different. Nobody talks about good governance anymore. There's no reference to good governance. There's very little reference to anti-corruption. And there are very clear reasons for that. I think 2011-12. They don't talk about good governance because then you have to, whatever is not good governance is bad governance, and then you're pointing at China. This is a very senior figure in the RG. How do you have a discussion with China about good governance? And China turns around and says, you got a problem with us moving 200 million people out of poverty. So there's that results-oriented perspective. So you can't really push that very hard. Again, by pointing fingers and screaming corruption, you don't get audience and ability to influence. People don't listen to you when you just, expose their weaknesses. But then, there are a lot of things that are about anti-corruption, but they're not called anti-corruption. It's the same thing. The 2004 WDR was on service delivery, and it was a code actually for government effectiveness. They didn't call it government effective, they called it service delivery. So there is that. And on the research front as well, there are changes taking place. WDR 2014 Governance and the Law looked at power asymmetries. They don't talk about politics directly, but they talk about power asymmetries. More game theoretic approach to governance. Micro foundations rather than that whole macro sphere. And here's another quote from a very major figure there. The focus is not institutions. The focus is on actors, how actors reach and sustain agreements. It's kind of difficult for me to get a hang of that as a political scientist, not to think in institutional terms, but this is how they see it. So a lot more refined view, and they focus on outcomes, focus on function rather than form. This is the final slide. If you can look at this interesting book called Making Politics Work for Development. So that's a very interesting document. And a lot of commitment to liberal democracy, but they don't talk about democracy either. Because they're scared of negative reactions from within and outside. If we say democracy, it's not going to lead internally to a good outcome. So you can't push that very far. Overall, conclusion, less belligerent, more tactful approach to governance. The focus is still there. And yet, perhaps in the grand scheme of things, we look at this as this process as the undermining of the appeal of these grand policy paradigms, ideas concocted in the North and dispensed from above in developing countries via conditional lending. The time for that is I don't say it's over, but definitely a weakening of that perspective. Here, I stop. Thank you very much. Thanks.